Thank you everyone for joining this afternoon, our Lunch with the Friends program. My name is Maya Swope and I'm the outreach coordinator here at Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness. We're excited to have you all be here for this last presentation of our climate change series this week, where we're kind of using the fact that our world leaders are meeting in Glasgow this week at International Climate Summit to really take a more close local look at some of climate issues here in Minnesota and some of the conversations around those climate change issues and research. So before we get started, I will just remind everyone that there is a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We'll have some time for questions at the end. So if you think of any questions throughout, please feel free to add those to that. We'll also have the chat function going. If you have any technical issues or have any comments throughout, please feel free to use the chat as well. And for anyone not familiar with Friends of the Boundary Waters, we are a nonprofit organization that's been around for more than 40 years, really focusing on protecting the boundary waters and the surrounding ecosystems, with the idea that people, wilderness, and community are all really tied together. And so we focus on, working with all of those different aspects to create a healthy and thriving wilderness. And as part of that is really thinking about climate change and how these issues will affect us kind of in the short term and the long term. So I'm really excited to announce to everyone today, Dr. Lee Frelich. He is the director of the University of Minnesota Center for Forest Ecology. He's one of the leading experts on climate change in the boundary waters and has done a lot of really interesting work in this area. So Dr. Frelich, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, Maya, thank you for that introduction. So I'm going to get right into the slides here, and we'll start with a broader context before we zoom into the boundary waters, namely the massive 200-year body of scientific data that we have on climate. And Fourier, for example, discovered that greenhouse gases exist in the atmosphere way back in the 1820s. So we're already looking at the 200th anniversary of the beginning of climate change science here. And there are other scientists like Tyndall who advanced that more in the 1860s, and Dr. Seuss here. This is not the same Dr. Seuss you're probably thinking of, but this is Dr. Hans Seuss, who proved that excess CO2 in the atmosphere actually came from fossil fuels way back in the 1950s, because it has a unique isotopic signature compared to natural sources of CO2. And then the really big player is Arrhenius, Swedish scientist. And although he won the Nobel Prize for discovering that salt dissolved in water conducts electricity, and that chemical reactions go faster at high temperatures, his real interest was in carbon dioxide and climate change. And in fact, he did the first projections of what would happen to the mean temperature for the world if we doubled the CO2 content of the atmosphere. It took him 2 years to calculate it using paper and pencil. Of course, that was pre-computer. And he published those projections in 1896, and they still stand today. Our fancy computer models that we have today are pretty much the same as what he projected, around a 4 degrees Celsius or 7 or 8 degree Fahrenheit increase in mean world temperature if we doubled the CO2 content of the atmosphere. Okay. Oh, there we go. So we also have tree ring analyses from boreal forests. For example, this is from the northern Ural Mountains in Russia. And there are trees there that are over 2,000 years old, and they are at the far northern edge of the range of where trees can grow. If you go any further north, it's Arctic tundra. So they are limited in their growth by temperature. And as you can see, just in the last few decades, the growth is faster than it's been in 2,000 years, and that is a response to the warming temperature. And then this is a composite climate change for the last 10,000 years using tree rings, sediment cores from ice and glaciers, a lot of different types of evidence synthesized here. And it does show the peak of the interglacial about 6 or 7,000 years ago when it was fairly warm. And then it shows for the last 5,000 years a natural cooling trend, and then the red line on the very right side is the reversal of the natural cooling trend due to fossil fuel burning. And we're now, of course, warmer than we were 7,500 years ago at the peak of this interglacial. And then if we look at temperature increase on the time scale of several decades, this shows the actual instrumental record. In other words, thermometers at weather stations. And if you go back to 1880, that's the first time that there were a sufficient number of weather stations around the world to get a really good estimate of mean world temperature. And so you see it year by year on this graph. And if you add 2019 and 2020, and they are even higher here on the right side, but you can see it's an upward trend in recent decades, and it's getting steeper and steeper. So we do have very significant warming that has already occurred, and it's going to continue to occur, maybe a lot or maybe not so much, depending on alternate scenarios that I'm going to tell you about. And those alternate scenarios on this graph, where the vertical axis here is carbon dioxide content, and the blue dot is about where we are. We're slightly higher now because that was 2008. But by the year 2100, are we going to the green dot, which is 550 parts per million, and we're at about 410 parts per million right now? Or are we going to go on a high emission, otherwise known as business as usual scenario, and be 900 parts per million? And those two alternate scenarios are hugely different from each other. Whether we follow this reduced emission scenario is tremendously important for the future of the world, and especially the boundary waters. And you see here the CO2 content of the atmosphere for the last 800,000 years, and the ups and downs there are that you see are the 100,000 year glacial cycles, which are driven by natural phenomena, and it varied from 180 to about 280 parts per million. Now we've already shot up to 400 parts per million, so that's as high as it's been in the last 2 million years, actually, if you go back even further than this to find a time when it was as high as it is now. And then these are temperature projections for the alternate scenarios by the year 2095, so the reduced emission scenario, like they are talking about have been talking about in Scotland over the last 2 weeks, and for the really highly reduced emissions, where we reduced by 80% or more our use of fossil fuels, we would only warm up by about 1 degree Celsius or 2 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe 3 degrees Fahrenheit here in the middle of North America. That would make the Twin Cities here about the same as Des Moines, Iowa. Or for the business as usual on the left, it would warm up by 7 or 8 degrees Fahrenheit, or Celsius, excuse me, which is around 12 or 13 degrees Fahrenheit. And that would make us as warm as the central part of Kansas. And why do scientists really care about this issue? Because if you look at the great extinctions in the history of the Earth, such as the Great Dying, which was the end of the Permian 250 million years ago, 4 out of the 5 great extinctions are associated or were associated with higher CO2 content in the atmosphere, in those cases due to natural phenomenon. And that led to acidification of the ocean and mass extinction on the planet. And so the same thing could happen now, except it's humans that are taking the place of volcanoes in terms of raising the CO2 content of the atmosphere, and we could create another mass extinction, which might end up including ourselves. And so that's why scientists think it's important. And there are a number of tipping points in the world, and one of them that is officially designated is the boreal forest in central North America, and the Boundary Waters is on the very southern edge of that. So it's very important that we go on the low emission scenario. Otherwise, massive swaths of this forest could die, and that would put a huge amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and that would negate our efforts to reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. So it is one of the world's tipping points at which we live at this point. So boreal forests, what are they? And this is a map of them. They are the coldest forests on the planet. They are just south of the Arctic tundra. So at the northern edge of the boreal, it's the coldest climate that any tree can possibly withstand. They're made up of spruce and fir, birch and aspen. There are also some species of pine and larch. And it does dip down into the arrowhead of Minnesota. So we have a little slice of that boreal forest in Minnesota. So basically it's a cold climate, very cold winters, long winters, short winters with cool or short summers and cool temperatures during summer is characteristic of boreal forests. So extreme winter cold, most of the temperate species like maple and oak can go down to about 45 below zero. They actually deep super cool. In other words, they have antifreeze-like substances in their sap. And it can go down to 45 below zero without freezing. And if it doesn't freeze, it's not going to kill the cambium, which is the living wood, which is just under the bark. So it actually does sometimes get that cold in northern Minnesota. During the polar vortex event of 2019, it was 56 below zero in Cotton, Minnesota, for example, but it doesn't get that cold as often as it used to. You can also get a boreal forest from having summers that are too cool or too short for temperate species like maple and oak. And that happens in places like Grand Marais on the shore of Lake Superior, or Isle Royale, or on the Door Peninsula in Wisconsin, where cold water in the Great Lakes upwells along shore and creates very cool summers, and it actually doesn't get very cold in the winter, and that can just throw the competitive balance to boreal species. So either extremely cold winters or short, cool summers, or both, can make a boreal forest like we have in the Boundary Waters. And you see the forest there at Tetagouche rest stop on the North Shore, which is a very good example of a boreal forest. So there's the area we're interested in. So boreal forests with jack pine, white spruce, black spruce, paper birch, aspen are the main species in our boreal forest. And there is a bigger picture showing mostly balsam fir and some white spruce here, and a lot of paper birch on the North Shore. So what about our regional temperature projections now for a reduced emission scenario, which is the bottom row, and a high emission scenario, which is the upper row, and then from left to right, it goes from now to mid-century and late century. So in the low emission scenario, and this one happens to be in degrees Fahrenheit because Don Wubbles and I use this slide in Washington, D.C., and there isn't any Celsius in Washington, D.C. So anyway, it's Fahrenheit, so 5 degrees warmer in summer. And I decided to show summer mean temperature because it's so critical for forests here instead of annual mean temperature or winter temperature. So summer temperature is the most critical. So 5 degrees warmer in summer, making us about the same as Des Moines, or in the upper scenario, the business as usual, 13 degrees warmer, which would make the boundary waters like southwestern Minnesota or maybe even like Omaha, Nebraska, and would make the Twin Cities like the middle of Kansas. So what's the difference between those two scenarios? Well, we'll find out over the next few minutes. With that business as usual scenario, we would expect the ranges of most tree species to move north by about 300 miles. So for balsam fir, the map on the left, the red areas indicate very high abundance. The blue line shows the absolute edge of the range where you would find any balsam fir at all. So that's our favorite Christmas tree, and with that high emission or business as usual scenario, it would basically exit Minnesota along with black spruce, white spruce, paper birch, would have similar results as would balsam poplar and a few other tree species. So that would be that basic impact. We have so many tree species where the southern edge of their range is here, and it's just barely cool enough to keep those species right now, and that could change dramatically. So I had a PhD student, Nick Fisichella, who studied the interactions between boreal and temperate species. He wanted to know what makes the difference between a boreal forest of spruce and fir and a temperate forest of maple, oak, and basswood. So he visited all these sites that you see, the black stars and the red triangles. The red triangles just had more detailed data collected. Otherwise, they were the same. And all of these are gradients from places with very cool summers, where it's mostly spruce and fir and just a little bit of maple and oak. And then either the western or the southern edge of each transect is areas with warm summers where it's mostly maple and oak and just a little bit of spruce fir. But on every one of these sites, maple and oak and spruce and fir are growing together side by side. So he looked at the growth rates of these species, the ring width, as well as the height growth of the species shown here: balsam fir, white spruce, red and sugar maple, and red oak. And basically there's a crossover point here between 64 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit for mean summer temperature. If it's cooler than that, the boreal species grow more. If it's warmer than that, the temperate species grow more, and they grow about the same right in the middle there. So if you look at a place like Duluth from 1960 to 1990, summers were cool enough that clearly spruce and fir would outgrow the temperate species. At this point, they're close to that crossover point, and in the near future, it's going to be warm enough that maples and oaks have very similar data, even though not shown here. So maple and oak would be able to outgrow spruce and fir, and therefore would gradually replace them in the forest, just because the summer temperature warmed up 1 or 2 degrees Fahrenheit. This is a state park in Wisconsin that has boreal forest. It's white spruce, balsam fir, and white cedar in this case. So very similar to what you would find on the North Shore in the Grand Marais area. And in 1979, you could not find a maple tree here. And I revisited it in 2016, and there's a sugar maple tree on the right, growing right in with the balsam fir in the understory and growing about the same in height each year. So this area formerly was too cool and for the temperate species, and now it's right near that crossover point, and so they're each growing about equally. And so the overall lesson here is temperate tree species are invading the understory of boreal forests in cases where the boreal and temperate species are growing next to each other. If you look under those boreal trees, there will be temperate tree seedlings underneath, and they are growing as well or better than the boreal seedlings. They have not had time to replace the boreal species yet. They haven't made their way up through the canopy, and it's not warm enough yet to kill the boreal forest, but so the mix zone where temperate and boreal species are mixed is becoming wider right now. But the temperate species could easily replace the boreal species as we move forward, and even more so if we go on the business as usual trajectory. Disturbances can interact with this transition from boreal forest to temperate forest that might occur. This is the big blowdown of 1999 in the boundary waters, and you notice on the after picture on the right, after the blowdown, the big trees are all knocked down, but it's still green because there are millions and millions of balsam fir and spruce and white cedar seedlings that were underneath the big trees. It's still a boreal forest at the time this picture was taken. It's just small boreal trees instead of big boreal trees. However, now that some of the boreal forests are invaded by temperate species like maple and oak, like you see in this picture, the red is red maple in the understory here. And the birch are dying there in this picture, but even if they weren't dying, if a big windstorm were to come and level the birch and the aspen and the spruce here, there could be an instant conversion to temperate forest following the windstorm instead of having it stay boreal like after the 1999 blowdown. So disturbances can definitely accelerate this transition more than faster than it would occur just with the maple trees and oak trees slowly making their way up through the canopy. So here are the boreal species, black and white spruce, balsam fir, jack and red pine, quaking aspen, paper birch. These are the most common in the boundary waters. And how about warming up the summers and not only the maple that I showed, the red maple, but how about some elm, bur oak, basswood, hickory, hackberry, and other temperate species. There actually is already a little bit of bur oak in the boundary waters and some basswood as well. And and red oak, northern red oak, they're limited to very small locations, mostly on the tops of hills or south-facing hillsides, but our studies indicate that their seedlings are spreading from those locations and that the seedlings are widespread underneath the boreal canopy at this point, with the relatively small magnitude of warming that has already occurred. So that's boreal versus temperate forest. What about any type of forest at all? In Minnesota, we are right at the edge of not only the boreal and temperate biomes, but the grassland or the prairie biome. So it's a unique place. We have three biomes coming together: temperate forest, boreal forest, and grassland or prairie. There are only a few other places like that in the world, one of which is northern Kazakhstan, for example, that have these three biomes coming together. But what makes the difference between forest, any type of forest, whether it's boreal or temperate, versus prairie? And you see the original meaning at the time of European settlement. Prairie forest border on the left, and another graduate student, Nick Dons, who's now on the faculty at the University of Wisconsin-Superior, studied that for his PhD and discovered that the border aligns approximately with a zero balance in water. In other words, where precipitation and evaporation are exactly equal, the water balance is zero. The green and blue areas on this map have an excess of precipitation over evaporation. So they're wet enough to have forests, and then the brown areas are getting to the zero water balance, and the darkest brown is actually negative, so there's more evaporation than precipitation. So that is what determined where the prairie forest border was. And the question is, where will that zero balance in precipitation and evaporation move in a warmer climate for the low and high scenario? Well, we'll see that in a minute here. And so it might move 300 miles, just like the ranges of trees would move about that far. That's what we think, but I'll show you more details coming up. And some of the things that can happen along the prairie forest border is what has happened already out in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And you see here a midsummer picture of an aspen forest right on the edge of the prairie forest border, and they are dead because of a drought that occurred in the early 2000s. So that type of thing could happen further east as the climate continues to warm. In addition to that, when trees are under drought stress, which they are when they're at the southern edge of their range and it starts to warm up more than they can tolerate, they'll have drought stress. They will not be able to defend themselves against insects as well as they could. With a cooler, wetter climate, there will be more forest fires, more diseases. So those, just like the windstorms, could help the temperate and boreal forest boundary move. As the climate changes, these things could help the prairie forest border move because they would work against a lot of different tree species. And then we have these weird periods of extreme cold and extreme warmth that last several weeks or even a few months at a time, like we had from June through October this summer, for example, the warmest summer recorded in the history of Minnesota. But you might also remember March of 2012 when it was in the 80s for a whole week in mid-March. We have 15,000 record high temperatures set in the United States. We had magnolias in bloom here in the Twin Cities on the 27th of March. Could that affect the boreal forest as well and help push things along? Well, yes. So phenology is the timing of biological events. For example, when trees open their buds and leaf out in the spring. And with that extreme warmth coming in March, a lot of trees in the boundary waters and then in adjacent Ontario in the lower picture did come out of dormancy too early. And then it got cold again. And so the needles all died. You can see a stand of balsam fir and jack pine in the upper left there, one of our study sites in the boundary waters, and then the vast expanse of brown spruce trees there in Ontario. These trees did recover because we had several normal years with normal temperatures and higher amounts of rain in 2013 through 2019, and they recovered. But 2 springs in a row like this could wipe out all the boreal forests from Minnesota all the way to the Atlantic Ocean in one fell swoop. And with the business as usual scenario, by 2095, an average spring would be like the spring of 2012. So just some added complications there. So warmer summers allowing maple and oak to replace boreal trees, wind maybe accelerating that process. Heat and drought stress and insect infestation due to lack of extreme cold that might otherwise kill the insects, and very early springs could all work against the boreal forest and help convert it either to temperate forest or to grasslands and savannas, which are grasslands with a few scattered trees. So here's the summary of what we found for what controls where these biomes are. And again, the temperate forest with warmer summers, boreal forest with cooler summers on the upper bar, and then the climatic moisture index, forest with wetter climates on the left, and prairies with drier climates with negative water balances on the right. What if you just map this out and just look at the whole landscape and turn it into little pixels, which in our case are 1 kilometer square, which is like about 40% of a square mile in size. and calculate the climate of each and put it on a map. Well, this is what you get. So if you look at the left, that's the current climate envelopes that support boreal forest, which is the blue. And you see northeastern Minnesota there, including much of the Boundary Waters, has a purely boreal climate at this point. And then that kind of minty green color is where you have boreal and temperate mixed together. And then the yellow is the broadleaf or the temperate forest. That would be your oak, maple, and basswood. And then the brown is prairie. So the prairie forest border has actually moved to the west. Since European settlement, you might remember it came across Minnesota northwest to southeast at the time of European settlement, and that's because in the early phases of climate change, we've gotten more rain, but evaporation has not gone up as much as rainfall, at least until this summer. Now that definitely reversed this summer. Whether that will continue as a pattern remains to be seen. We had way more evaporation than rainfall this particular summer, but if you look over the last 3 or 4 decades, on average, it's been rainier and not a big increase in evaporation. So prairie climates have actually moved off to the west, but we think that will reverse as climate change progresses. So looking at the low in the upper right, the low warming scenario, prairies would push back in a little bit, the boreal would recede a little bit, as would the mixed boreal and temperate, but it would still look like Minnesota. For the business as usual or the high warming scenario in the lower right, you can see that the prairie forest border would indeed move about 300 miles, and only the northeastern tip of the arrowhead would have forest at all, and that would not be boreal forest. It would be maple and oak forest mixed with savannas in the Boundary Waters. And so Minnesota would be the new Kansas. 90% of Minnesota would have climates that would support prairies, which is where the quote from me in the Washington Post that we have a perfectly good Kansas now, and we don't need a second Kansas in Minnesota. So that's where that quote came from, was me speaking to a reporter at the Washington Post. And making a statement like that is how to get feedback from everybody in the world, as I discovered. I'm not going to tell you what type of feedback, but you can imagine, use your imagination. So let's look at a climate analog. Can we find a place that's like the Boundary Waters, which is the blue star? Oh, it looks like it's slipped into the Quetico there. But anyway, the Boundary Waters and adjacent Quetico provincial park, which have essentially the same climate. Can we find an area that's like that right now, where the summers right now have a climate like they might have, say, in the year 2060 or 2070? And that is the orange star, which is near Granite Falls, Minnesota. So you can go to Granite Falls and you can look and see what is the vegetation like. As the name Granite Falls implies, there are actually some granitic rock outcrops there. So even the physiography of the landscape and the substrate in terms of rock is similar to the Boundary Waters. So it's a good analog for the future of the Boundary Waters. So here's the Boundary Waters. This is a black spruce and paper birch forest growing on 2.8 billion year old granite in the Boundary Waters. And here's what happens if you take that and you look at very similar physiography, but the only difference is summers are about 8 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. You get this, which is nice outcrops natural area near Granite Falls, and you can see clumps of oak trees and patches of prairie here mixed together on very similar rock type and soil conditions as you have in the Boundary Waters. And again, the only difference in these two pictures is about 8 degrees Fahrenheit in mean summer temperature. Whoops. And of course, if you shift the vegetation, you shift the wildlife. All wildlife depends on the vegetation. It lives in it, depends on it in many, many ways. So if you change the vegetation, you change the wildlife. For example, lynx in boreal forest and bobcat in temperate forest or prairie types of environments. Moose in the boreal forest, deer in the temperate forest, and for birds, you could pick many, many examples. But I happen to, oh, there's a mistake here. Blackback woodpecker should be the upper one and red-bellied woodpecker should be the lower one. So just in your mind, try to reverse those labels. So blackback woodpecker replaced by red-bellied woodpecker. Blackback woodpecker is one of my favorites in the Boundary Waters. And there are already red-bellied woodpeckers that have been seen in the Ely area. So, and deer has moved into northeastern Minnesota, and so are bobcats. So I actually made this slide for Amy Klobuchar, and she was going to give a speech on the floor of the Senate, and this was probably 5 or 6 years ago. And so it's my estimation of the level at which the U.S. senators can understand climate change. So yeah, moose being replaced by deer is something that anyone can understand. So we have those alternative futures for the Boundary Waters. It can stay boreal, maybe a little bit of intrusion of the temperate forest, but would still have the boreal conifers present for the reduced emission scenario. And actually white pine would do better than it does today. It's a little bit on the cold side for white pine today. It would actually do better if it warmed slightly and stayed just slightly warm, whereas the business as usual scenario would lead to widespread grasslands and savanna and some oak forests in the Boundary Waters. And you see David Luke's photo here. He did many photos of iconic scenes in the Boundary Waters and then digitally erased the vegetation above the water and substituted pictures taken in southwestern Minnesota of prairies or savannas. So you see the boreal forest that's there at Duncan Lake, and it's reflected in the water, but above the water line is an oak savanna. So that's another way to visualize what might happen in the future. So that's all I plan to say. Oh, no, that isn't all I plan to say. I have one more slide. Sorry about that. I forgot. How do we solve the problem? Well, stop subsidizing fossil fuels, switch to renewable energy, increase the energy efficiency that we use, stop deforestation, regenerative agriculture, and eat more plants, which helps regenerative agriculture, more plant agriculture and less animal agriculture, are all ways to reduce the emissions of CO2. And with that, that was all I have planned to say.
Great. Well, thank you so much for this presentation. Super informative, and yeah, just interesting to see what those projections are. I just want to take a second here and kind of remind folks that Give to the Max Day is coming up next week, next Thursday, a week from today. And that is one of our biggest fundraising days of the whole year here at Friends of the Boundary Waters. And so encourage you to check out this link that is here on the screen. I will also send it in a follow-up email. But really, for us to continue to bring these presentations to you, for us to continue to work on protecting the boundary waters in the future and really adapting to the different ecosystems that will be there in the years to come. It's essential that we have your support, and we're grateful to all of our members and to everyone else who's here today. So I just wanted to throw that in there before we jump into the question and answer. And I think if you want to go ahead and stop sharing your screen, we can kind of go to the Q&A. So a reminder for folks, the chat or the Q&A, I will kind of read out any questions that I see in there and get to as many as we are able to. I'm seeing in the chat, we have a question from Susan who says, would you please comment on the impact we can have more regionally by making changes? Is it an all or nothing action on overall climate change?
Well, every little bit helps. Every person in every region of the world has to do its part. It is a global thing. I mean, only the entire world as a whole can reduce CO2 emissions, but each region of the world is unique, and how you reduce CO2 emissions in a given region is unique, right? So in our case, we do have places where we can plant trees. We do have good alternatives for energy sources other than burning coal. And so, and we do have good choices for our food sources, for example. And so there's a lot of different strategies that we can take here, and it varies. You know, if you're in a desert region, you're not going to try to reduce CO2 emissions by planting forests. So each region is different, and that list of things that I presented, that really is tailored for our region. We can do all of those things in Minnesota, and so that's our part.
Great, yeah, thank you. I see a question from Mike here who says, based on your projections, if we are successful in preventing global warming above 1.5 degrees Celsius, will we see the change to temperate forests that you outlined?
Yeah, we would see very small changes. So the boundary waters would still have pines, it would still have spruce and fir. There would be some increase or some intrusion, if you want to look at it that way, of maple and oak into the forests in the boundary waters, but it would not be extremely extensive. And we certainly wouldn't end up with prairies or savannas in the boundary waters if we follow that reduced emission scenario. So it would still look pretty similar to today. So the alternatives are so different in the boundary waters because it's so close to the biome boundaries of temperate forest, boreal forest, and grassland. And so it's so susceptible to changes in climate because it's near those edges of biomes more than most of the world is. Having those edges makes Minnesota an interesting place. It also makes Minnesota a place where changes could be really big compared to most of the world in terms of our natural resources, and especially the vegetation and wildlife species. But we could still have conifers in the boundary waters with the reduced emission scenario.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and kind of speaking to some of those changes, a few people were wanting more info about Minnesota's iconic red and white pines. So Libby had asked, how are the pines expected to do between red and white pines? Is one going to adapt better to warming temperatures? And yeah, there are a few other folks that kind of had similar questions.
Yeah, well, the situation for red pine is not good because we've brought in a bunch of exotic fungal diseases that infect red pine foliage. And it's really hard to regenerate red pine, and it's more sensitive to a warming climate than white pine. So if we follow the reduced emission scenario, I think we would hold on to some red pine in the boundary waters. We'd have a little bit of a tough time. White pine would do really well. This white pine actually has a warmer optimum temperature than the boundary waters has right now, and it would grow even better if it warmed up slightly. For the business as usual scenario, neither of them would do very well, but I think red pine is the most vulnerable. And even with the reduced emission scenario, we would see some problems with red pine. I'm not sure it would disappear. The boundary waters would have the best chance of retaining red pine of all the areas within Minnesota, and white pine would do just fine with the reduced emission scenario.
Great, yeah, and I see other folks are kind of wondering about other tree species that So if you could talk a little bit more about how these warming temperatures would affect specifically white cedars and tamaracks.
Okay, white cedar and tamarack, yeah. Well, with the reduced emission scenario, I wouldn't expect much of a change in white cedar or tamarack in northern Minnesota at all. And there is some problem with the warmer winters that we've already had with the larch beetle causing mortality in tamarack. So that problem will continue. But other than that, with the reduced emission scenario, I don't expect a lot of other problems. And I think those species would continue to do quite well. But of course, again, with the business as usual scenario and the high warming scenario, those species could end up being reduced in area that they occupy. They, like the white cedar, wouldn't grow on south facing lake shores, for example. It might be too hot and too dry for it. There'd be fewer bogs and fewer places where tamarack would grow. Yeah, the reduced emission scenario would be okay for those species.
Mm-hmm. I see some folks who are wondering kind of, with these changes in species, what that means for management. So I see someone in the chat has said the Boundary Waters Forest is now managed only by prescribed fire. As things change, are there arguments for more management, harvesting, planting of species that like warmer temps?
Yeah, if we were to go on the business as usual scenario, and it looked like the Boundary Waters is going to become an oak savanna, and there's just no way you were going to prevent that, then you might as well make it be the best savanna it can be. And that would mean keeping invasive species like buckthorn out of the Boundary Waters. We might have to facilitate the movement in that case of some of the savanna species into the Boundary Waters because they're stuck on little tiny postage stamps of remnant savannas hundreds of miles to the south in southwestern Minnesota. And a lot of those species would have no way to get to the Boundary Waters. So we might have to assist them in making that jump. Bur oak would be one of the main tree species, and there's actually some bur oak already present in the Boundary Waters that was established 7,500 years ago in the warm spell we had at that point. And those bur oak trees have been hanging around for over 7,000 years waiting for the climate to warm up. So for them, it would be a great thing. Anytime you have a big change in the environment, it's bad for one group of species and good for another. So what's bad for black spruce and balsam fir and jack pine would be good for bur oak and red oak and basswood and red maple, for example. But yeah, we really need to do this reduced emission scenario. And if you don't like the arguments politicians are making, then maybe you'll go for the argument that the Boundary Waters won't change very much with the reduced emission scenario.
Yeah, I think some folks maybe are wondering too if they have cabins up near the Boundary Waters or other parts of northern Minnesota, are there certain things that they should be doing now for management in terms of types of species to plant or kind of other considerations to take at this point?
Yeah, well, if you have a cabin and you happen to have a maple tree or a basswood tree or an oak tree on your property, which you might because they are present, just make sure that you don't cut those down because they might be useful in the future if we do go to a much warmer climate and you would want those species to expand. On the other hand, if you have a north-facing slope or a bog with black spruce, you want to take care of that too because you want to keep it around as long as possible. So looking at things that are at the very southern edge of their range and the northern edge of their range, and because it's an edge, the whole Boundary Water is at a bigger scale as an edge habitat. You want to keep as many of those things as around as possible so that there's as much diversity as possible so that the forest can respond to whatever happens. If we do the reduced emission scenario, it'll warm up a little bit, but by the end of the century, it'll be cooling again. And we might, by the middle of the 2100s for your great grandchildren, might be as cool as it was in 1950. And so you would want those little remnants, or refugia as we would call them, of the boreal species like black spruce and fir to stay around so that they could spread if it cools again. So we're looking at long time frames here. Otherwise, fire preparedness is a big deal in the boundary waters because the fire season is getting longer. If we do have a drought, there's so much more evaporation like we had this summer because it was so hot and things dried out faster and got much drier than we ever thought possible in a very short time. And that means more fire weather. So definitely follow fire-wise principles if you have a cabin. You might want to have a balsam fir tree overhanging your roof, but in a fire, that's not a good thing. You don't have to clear cut the forest, but if the understory is not full of balsam fir saplings, and there's a project around Ely to clear some of that out, that'll be helpful in the case of a fire so that its behavior won't be so extreme as it approaches your cabin. Having a fireproof roofing material and so on. And some people have sprinkler systems, all those things are things you have to pay attention to. And then you have to keep in mind that fires are actually normal there. The greenwood fire like we had this summer is completely normal type of fire you have in the boundary waters. But the frequency of fires like that will probably go up as the climate warms. And even if it only warms a little bit, it'll still go up because we're going to have drought years from time to time. Big fires are normal in that type of forest.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I just want to comment, I see we still have a bunch of questions left, so we might not get to all of these. And if anyone has remaining questions, we'll probably have time for another one or two. Feel free to email me and I can pass those along and try to make sure they get answered. I think I kind of just wanted to end on a question tying this back to some, current politics stuff. Susan is asking, what's your assessment of the COP summit in Glasgow? Is enough currently being proposed to lead to reduced emission scenarios?
I'm not very optimistic about what happened at COP. I mean, how many times before have we had these meetings? We had the COP 21 in Paris and everybody referred to it as the Paris Agreement, and yet it never actually happened. We never actually reduced the emissions that were agreed to then. And so we've had these different meetings over the years and they always agree to reduce emissions, and yet it never happens. So why should we believe them this time? But maybe I'll be wrong. Maybe this time will be the one where something actually starts to happen. But it comes from the grassroots. If people demand that politicians take action, that's what makes them take action. They never look at something and say, oh, this would be a good thing to do, I'll just do it. They only do things because people yell at them or complain about things, basically. So the more grassroots, the more they hear from voters that it's important, the more likely they are to actually follow through with what they agree to at some of these summits that they have.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think kind of points us back to the need to get involved in local climate groups that are taking action both in Minnesota or even on a bigger level, whether that is, getting more involved with the work of the Friends or choosing another local group in your area that is doing good climate work. I think, this is a time that it's a very serious time, and it's clear that, maybe these kind of international conventions are not the way that things will get solved most quickly, but people organizing in their own communities is a really great way to work on that. So we are kind of nearing towards the end of the hour here. I can fit in maybe another time for 1 or 2 more questions. Let's see. Maybe just kind of a quick question. A few people had more like specific tree related things that they wanted to know about. So someone asking, are yellow birches as at risk as white birches?
Yellow birch is actually a temperate species, so it belongs in with maple and oak and basswood. And it's actually at the far northern edge in boundary waters. You know, I know of a few groves of yellow birch that are in and just outside the boundary waters, and because it's at the northern edge of their range, they can be like a foot in diameter and be 200 years old because they're not growing fast because it's not an ideal climate for them. So they would probably do better, but if it got too dry, they wouldn't. So, you know, they might end up being a swamp species in a warmer climate. So they'd be able to grow throughout the boundary waters climatically in terms of temperature, but maybe not in terms of water. So they're basically a warm, wet species. So they like upper Michigan. You know, 35 or 40 inches of rain a year and 3 feet deep of silty soil, and winters that are not 50 below zero is good for yellow birch. So yeah, they might increase in abundance for a few decades and then die out because it comes too dry, you know, because they're limited by temperature now, and they might be limited by moisture in the future if we go on the high warming scenario.
Sure, yeah. Well, that makes a lot of sense, and I hope that answers the question for the person that asked that. Again, a reminder that, yeah, feel free to forward questions to me if anyone has a question they want answered that we didn't have time for. I'll just kind of call out as well. I just put a link in the chat that will direct you to our Give to the Max Day page. So if you're enjoyed the presentation and are able to support Friends of the Boundary Waters, that's the place to do it. But otherwise, I will just say thank you so much, Dr. Frelich, for a great presentation. This was so informative, and thank you all for joining this afternoon and for being part of our Friends of the Boundary Waters world here. So thanks again. Hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Yeah, and you're welcome. I'm happy to do the presentation.
Great, thank you.